Okay, so hopefully you had fun with that little activity, and hopefully it gave you an insight into what I am talking about when I talk about elements of appeal. So let's go over some ways that we can work with our readers to discover what they found appealing about a story that they liked. I found that the best approach is a mixture of closed and open-ended questions. Sometimes you can't rush back over to your computer to read the synopsis or reviews of a story. So you've got to be able to coax out the elements of the story from your interviewee without using complicated language. You want to ask things like, what kind of story was it? They might tell you that it was a funny story or a story about unicorns or first love. Whatever they tell you here, that first thing they tell you about is going to be one of the more important elements, especially if it's a younger student responding to the question. Older students and adults who are comfortable talking about genre might straight up tell you that it was sci-fi or horror. But if you're lucky, they'll add something along the lines of, but it was really more about frenemies working together, or but it had a really great love triangle. So ask them what happened in the story. What they remember from it is a good indicator of what appealed to them. Ask them what their favorite part was. That's an even better springboard. Feel free to ask questions like, what was the main character like? If they get stuck here, and younger students especially may, prompt them a little. Were they funny, brave, scared, kind? You might simply get yes back as an answer to all of the above. This is a good indicator that character wasn't the biggest draw for them. Or if they say like, I don't know, or if they're just not particularly convinced of their answer, it's probably not the most important element to them. The art of RA is finding out which elements are important to your reader and which just really weren't. Keep the language simple when you're conducting interviews. Not everyone is familiar with the language we use to describe books. People in the book business don't talk about stories like everybody else does. Get comfortable talking about books like readers again. Talk about them with each other. Talk about them with coworkers, with your students, with your family, with your friends. Just talk about them and listen to how they're talking back to you. So, one of the things that Becky Spratford talks about is that we all got into this profession because of some kind of something that happened to us that involved a book, whether it was whether we were voracious readers as children, or we picked up that one book that just kind of changed everything for us. Most of us, if not all of us, got into this profession because we love stories. Everything else probably came after. Most of us who are in the library field probably didn't get into this because we are passionate about data analytics or or metadata or even pedagogy. We probably initially got into it because of our love of stories. So that is something really important that we need to circle back to. We need to remember when we are talking to other readers. Okay, so you have an idea of what would appeal to your reader. The challenge isn't over. Now you have to find them a title. So, according to Ingenta, the US published 304,912 books in 2013. That's just the US. The UK also published 184,000, Canada just under 20,000, and Australia just over 28,000, and New Zealand about 3,600. We don't know how many of those books were published in English, but considering English is the primary language spoken in all of those countries, it's safe to assume that a large portion of them were. So we're likely looking at around 540,000 books published in 2013. Of those, say, 500,000 books, obviously not all of them are going to be applicable to the population you serve, but a good number of them will be. Even if only 20% of that number were both in English, because we're not going to talk about Reader's Advisory in world languages or Spanish in this particular workshop, but maybe in the future, because that is a different kettle of fish. So even if only 20% of that number were both in English and for children through young adult audiences, that's over 108,000 titles. There's no possible way that you could learn all of their titles, let alone their synopses. You're certainly not going to read them all. So curation is bae. There are no two ways about it. In order to have a successful RA program at your school or at your public library, you're going to need to focus A, on titles that work for your specific school community, and B, on the titles that you have or can get access to. I'm not saying that you should be acquiring homogenous titles or that you should never suggest a book that you don't have access to. What I'm saying is that to the best of your ability, you need to work within your means for the community that you have. That's an important distinguishment that I don't think we talk about enough. You're collecting for the community you have, not the one that you want. Don't forget about all of your own biases, your opinions, your likes and dislikes, and how they influence your acquisition and suggestions, because they do. Make no mistake about it, they do. It happens to me all the time. I am vegan through and through. I abhor the use of animal products for any reason. And people ask me for cookbooks all the time. And I have to mentally fight myself to give them the title that fits their needs, not the title I want them to read. So we need to remember that we are making suggestions for them. We are not making recommendations, and that is a very important distinguishment. Distinguishment? I'm sorry, I had a concussion about 6 months ago, and sometimes I still use words. I don't think distinguishment is the right word, but I can't think of the correct one, so we're going to go with that. We're making suggestions. We're not making recommendations because we haven't read all these titles. And even if we have, we are not giving them recommendations based on what we liked, what we think that they should be reading. We are trying to find the best fit for them. So, how do we put together these super awesome curated lists that I'm talking about? We'll get there. But before we do, I would like to do a quick little activity. And what I want you to do here is I want you to take a look through this chart that I made and assign yourself a rating out of, say, 5, based on how comfortable you are with all of these genres. Tailor it specifically to the population that you serve. So, for example, if you're a high school librarian, think about titles in these genres that may appeal to your students. If you work with younger elementary school students, think about the picture books, easy readers, and beginning chapter books that may fall within these genres. I am sure that you'll notice that the last row in the table refers to types of materials rather than genre. There are, of course, genres within each of these categories of materials. There are sci-fi comics and romance mangas, etc. But I find that this is the area in which many librarians start to stumble. Most of us are more comfortable with traditional books than we are with illustrated stories and podcasts. So rather than subdividing these categories into their genres, I want you to just rate your knowledge of them as a whole for now. So think about graphic novels that would be appropriate for middle schoolers, or comics that are more suited to high schoolers. We're not even going to touch on nonfiction right now. We could do a whole workshop on reading nonfiction for pleasure, and maybe that's something that I'll do in the future, but we're just focusing on fiction for today. So, uh, Becky Heil, I'm not sure. I apologize, Becky. The district consultant Southeast for the State Library of Iowa shared a similar graph in her webinar, Reader's Advisory 101, which is fantastic, by the way. Don't think about this too hard. Just rate yourself based on how comfortable you feel, not just with knowing titles in these areas, but in knowing about them too. So, take a look at your self-assessment. Where are you strongest? Where could you improve? Now, stop thinking about your own proficiencies for a second and think about the people around you. Think about your teachers, staff members, parents, and most importantly, your students. Where are your human resources? I don't mean the administrative department. I mean, who in your school community or library community are the readers that you can go to for assistance? Is there a teacher who's really into sci-fi? Does someone in the office love to read contemporary fiction? You know, there's probably someone in IT who can school your knowledge of comics. But there are also kids who can run circles around you in terms of genre knowledge. Who's always got a Stephen King book in their hand? Who ripped through the Serafina series in a week? Who worships Elephant and Piggy? Oh, who doesn't worship Elephant and Piggy? Let's be real. But talk to them. Anecdotal lists are a fountain of content that you absolutely should be plumbing. Book lists are great, don't get me wrong, but let's be real. They aren't always objective, and they certainly aren't curated for your specific community. So who better to ask for input than the members of your community? You don't need an MLIS to recommend a book. Talk to them, ask questions, give them a way to reach out to you. Supply feedback forms, get yourself a Google Voice number and let them text you. Set aside time during library, maybe during book swap, to talk to them about what they're reading. Make conversation with your colleagues during breaks, at meetings, on the way out to your cars, whatever. Just talk to them.